cloud. Wait, all right. I am the host and
And
I'm recording to the cloud. We're doing great. All right. So now I'm going to share my screen with the sources. Um, Actually, even before I do
You
that,
have a handout? Do you have a handout that you want to
yeah,
share with us?
yeah, I'm going to share the handout, but I'm just going to tell you about the handout for 1 minute, and then I will share the screen with the handout. The sources that we're going to look at today basically came out of a class that I taught at Yeshiva Maharan. The class was on the halachot of the Beit Knesset, of like basically different laws relating to synagogue ritual, to choices that we make in the synagogue. And what I started noticing when we were learning through these different laws is that so many of the laws are instituted specifically in order to prevent fights from breaking out in shul. And I just thought that that was very interesting, right? That there was this sense that, like, I had always thought that, shul was like this friendly place where you'd come in order to, have everybody kind of daven together and learn Torah together. But in these sources, it started to feel like the rabbis imagined that all the shuls were like, I thought of it as like sort of on the precipice of disaster, like at any moment a fight was going to break out. And so therefore, through the halachot, you had to sort of constantly think about like what were the kinds of situations that could lead people to get into a fight and how could you try to like avert them. So I'm going to show you some examples of it, and then I'm interested in kind of hearing what people in the class think about it. So let me now share the screen with the sources. Here we go. Okay, I called it on the precipice of disaster because of this feeling in the sources that at any point, crazy fights were going to break out. Let me make them a bit bigger. Can people read these? Is this okay? Should I make it bigger still?
yes, good,
A
very
little.
good.
Good. A little bigger. Okay, let's see if we can make it a little bigger. Okay, how about that? Is that good?
Good.
Great.
Yes,
Okay,
good.
amazing. All right, here we go. So, first halacha that we have over here is, let me see if I can get this to go here. The first halacha that we have, source number 1, is from the Shulchan Aruch. We're told, Kohen kore batorah rishon, v'acharav Levi, v'acharav Yisrael. This is the order of the aliyot. The Kohen always gets the first aliyah. If there's a Levi, the Levi always gets the second aliyah. Does anybody know what happens if there's no Levi? What do we do?
Yisrael gets it, no?
So actually, if there's no Levi, we call the same Kohen up 2 times, right?
Oh,
So normally it
yeah.
would be if there's a Kohen, the Kohen gets the first Aliyah. If there's a Levi, the Levi gets the second Aliyah. If there is a Yisrael, the Yisrael gets the third Aliyah. That would be on a weekday morning. If it's Shabbat, the Kohen gets the first Aliyah, the Levi gets the second Aliyah, and Yisraelim get the remaining Aliyot, right? All of the remaining.
There's a Kohen, however, right? And but no Levi. The Kohen gets the Levi Aliyah as well.
Exactly. And you always give it to the same Kohen, right? Let's say you have 2 Kohanim, but no Leviim, right? You might think like, oh, you give the first Aliyah to the first Kohen, you give the second Aliyah to the second Kohen, but we don't do that. We always give, if there's no Levi, we always give the same Kohen the first 2 Aliyot. Does anybody know why?
I haven't the vaguest idea.
So the reason why, the reason that the halacha gives is that we don't want anybody to assume that there was something that was wrong with the first Kohen. The assumption is if you call up a Kohen for the first Aliyah and then you call a Kohen up for the second Aliyah, people might think that like, oh, maybe there's something wrong with the lineage of the first Kohen and like we had to like replace him with a second Kohen. So we never want to impugn the lineage of any of the Kohanim. So if there's a Kohen and no Levi, that Kohen gets the first 2 Aliyot. If there's a Kohen and a Levi, the Kohen gets the first Aliyah, the Levi gets the second Aliyah. What happens if there are no Kohanim, but there are Leviim? What do we do then?
A Levi gets it.
Then a Levi can get the first Aliyah. He doesn't have to, right? The first Aliyah can go to anybody. It can go to a Yisrael. If there's no Kohen, first Aliyah goes to a Kohen, can go to a Levi or to a Yisrael. But we never give the second Aliyah to a
Yes.
Levi if the first Aliyah was not given to a Kohen. And the reason for that is that once we give the second Aliyah to a Levi, it makes everybody assume that whoever had the first Aliyah is a Kohen, and we don't want them to think that if the first person wasn't a Kohen. So if there's no Kohen there, then a Levi or anybody else could get the first Aliyah. It has to be a Yisrael who gets the second Aliyah, and all the other Aliyot go to Yisraelim as well. Now, one other interesting thing that happens sometimes is, let's say you have like a simcha of some sort, like a bar mitzvah or an afraf, where the bar mitzvah boy is from a family of Kohanim. And sometimes then you might want to give an Aliyah out to more than one Kohen, right? Let's say you want to give the boy's father an Aliyah or the boy's grandfather. So, right, but generally we only give the first Aliyah to the Kohen. Do you know what, if we wanted to give out more Kohen Aliyot, do you know what we would do? Has anybody seen this happen ever?
Add maybe additional parts
Yeah,
to
great.
the
Exactly.
Torah reading.
Exactly. So what we could do is either add extra aliyot, right? Sometimes that's done, right? If you add an acharon, or once the 7 aliyot are done, you can always give the kohen the maftir aliyah, because it's not thought of as part of the set of 7. So sometimes what they'll do is they'll give the bar mitzvah boy the maftir aliyah, so he'll get the last maftir aliyah, and then he'll name the haftorah, and they'll give either the father or the grandfather the first aliyah, which is just kind of an interesting issue that comes up sometimes. Okay, great. So we'll go back to our sources over here. Okay, so the Kohen always gets the first aliyah if there's a Kohen, the Levi gets the second one, and afterwards the Yisrael. Then the Mishnah Brura, which is, so that was the Shulchan Aruch is written by Rav Yosef Karo, kind of around the year 1500. And the Mishnah Brura is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch that is written by the Chafetz Chaim in like the late 1800s, early 1900s. Okay, so here we're told, Kohen Koreh Batorah Rishon, right? The Mishnah Brura explains, well, why is it that the Kohen gets the first aliyah? Dichtiv v'kidashto. Because the Torah says that we should sanctify the Kohen, and what that means is that we give the Kohen certain special privileges. And the Mishnah Berurah actually lists some of these privileges, and you might have seen people do this. If, let's say, people are eating together and you want someone to lead the zimun, often we'll say like, oh, the Kohen should lead the zimun. Or if, let's say, you are serving a meal, you might want to give like the first choice of the food to the Kohen. These were ways of setting the Kohen kind of aside and giving the Kohen elevated status. But the Mishnah Berurah explains that for everything else except for reading from the Torah, if the Kohen wants to forgive his honor, he can, right? If we said to Joe Cohen, oh, Joe Cohen, please lead the Zimun, Joe could say, no, it's okay. I'd rather Bert lead the Zimun, right? And that would be completely reasonable. But the only time that the Kohen is not allowed to forgive his honor, the Mishnah Berurah says over here, aval li'inyan likrot b'Torah bebeit Knesset. But when it comes to reading from the Torah, in other words, getting the first aliyah in the synagogue, tiknu chazal mipnei darkei shalom she'ein hakohen v'halevi yicholim limchol. Right, so Chazal or Chachamenu Zichronam Livracha, our sages of blessed memory, right? They instituted that in order to preserve the peace, the Kohen and the Levi are not allowed to forgive their honors. Ella dafka Kohen Rishon. Rather, it is always the case that the Kohen must get the first aliyah, v'acharav Levi, and afterwards the Levi gets the second aliyah, v'acharav Yisrael, and afterwards the Yisrael gets the third aliyah. Why? Kedei shelo yavo hadavar lidei machloket. We don't want the matter to come to a fight, to strife. Shekol echad yomar ani gadol ve'ekra rishon, right? The concern is that if we don't give the first aliyah to the Kohen, all of the rest of us will start fighting, and each one of us will say, hey, I should get that aliyah because I am the greatest one here, right? And so the sense was that like kind of everybody wants the first aliyah because everyone wants
that assumes it's perfect, because only in a Jewish congregation would there be dissension about who goes first. It's like almost anticipating chaos.
Well, my grandkids.
Hold on a second. It's anticipating chaos because of human nature, that people.
100%. Yeah, totally. I totally agree with you, right? There's a sense that actually, I was going to ask the class this question. Does this, right? Tova says this seems reasonable to her, right? If we didn't give the first aliyah to the Kohen, everyone else would fight about it. I'm just curious, what do the rest of the people think? Do you think that this is true? If we didn't give the first aliyah to a Kohen, would everybody else fight about it? Or would people sort of be happy with getting the third aliyah or the fifth aliyah?
Fight over it.
You think they would? Ruby says they would fight over it. Okay, does anybody not think people would fight over it?
I'm happy just to get any aliyah. I'm a
Yeah,
child.
exactly, right? I mean, I would have thought that, right? If you get like the fifth aliyah or the sixth aliyah, like that's also great. But what I've been told is that in some shuls, people care very much about which aliyah you're getting, right? To get like the fifth aliyah is like an insult. You really want the third aliyah, right? I didn't even know that that was a thing. So the Mishnah Berurah assumes that people would, if the first aliyah was open to everyone, everyone would fight over it, and so therefore we always give the first aliyah to a kohen. Now, honestly, there could still be a fight, right? Because like often in a shul, there could be 3 or 4 kohanim, right? So maybe aren't we worried that these kohanim will fight with one another about who gets the first aliyah? Apparently, the Mishnah Berurah says, no, we don't worry about that. I guess the kohanim get aliyot frequently enough that they're not going to fight amongst themselves. One thing that is very interesting.
Rabba, is it also true that the Kohen should have the honor? I mean, he's the Kohen. I mean,
Yes.
wouldn't it be reasonable also to give the honor to the Kohen in terms of
100%. Right. For sure, it's reasonable to give the honor to the Kohen. The question is, once we offer the honor to the Kohen, is the Kohen allowed to say, no, it's okay, this other person can have it, right?
Yes.
Which the Kohen is allowed to do for all the other things, right? If we say, oh, Mr. Cohn, would you like to lead the Zimun? Mr. Cohn could say, no, it's okay. I'd like Robert to lead it instead, right? That would be totally reasonable. The only time that the Cohen is not allowed to say, no, let's just give it to somebody else is when it comes to the first aliyah, the Kohen always has to get the first aliyah. Now, there is one very interesting exception to this in the halachic discourse, which is apparently, I don't know if you've ever seen this. In some shuls, there's the practice of auctioning off aliyot. Have you guys ever been somewhere where they do this? There's some shuls in Europe that do this, right? It can actually take a long time because before the Torah reading starts, there's this like whole auction that goes on, but it's a way that the shul
makes
Not,
money?
not on a regular Shabbos. I've never
It's
seen
only on
Yeah,
Simchas
I have
Torah.
it. Maybe.
I have
Simchas
totally
Torah.
seen it on a regular Shabbat. We were actually, my husband Mike and I were in Las Vegas a couple of months ago. We were teaching at a shul there, and there was like an entire auction before the tefillah started. It happens more often in Sephardi shuls than in Ashkenaz shuls. I think it's more of a custom there, but often there's like a whole auction, and that's the way the shul raises money, right? People, commit to giving certain amounts of money after Shabbat in order to get an aliyah.
And
So
originally, Rabbi Wendy, well, I got to meet Rabbi Katz, as a as a scholar in residence for Pesach, and over Pesach, both for the holiday readings and the Shabbos readings, they auction things off because they have hundreds of people, and so therefore they don't want to, they auction it off for some charitable thing, and they don't want to say, oh, we're going to give this to somebody who whatever is more honorable or whatever, so they auction it off for its tzedakah.
oh, that's very interesting. But they probably still give it, they still give the first aliyah to a Kohen though, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the Kohanim that are there fight over it, or
Mm.
somebody wants to, oh, my uncle's a Kohen,
Yeah.
whatever.
That's very interesting. So okay, so the one exception to the case of the Kohen getting the first aliyah is apparently there used to be some synagogues where the most desirable aliyah to get was the first aliyah of Breshit, right? That was the one that people most wanted. It was the first aliyah of the whole Torah on Shabbat Breshit. And so the community could really raise a lot of money by auctioning off that aliyah. So it was understood that in communities that had the practice of auctioning off the first aliyah of Breshit, that was the one time where Kohanim didn't get it. It could go to whoever, paid the most money to get the first aliyah. But that's if that's already the established practice. But if the shul instead had the practice of giving out the first aliyah on Shabbat Breshit to the Kohanim, and then they decided to change the practice in order to start auctioning it off, then the Kohanim have to agree. And if the Kohanim say, no, we want that first aliyah, the shul can't make that change. But if the practice was already in place, if some previous generation had agreed to it, then later Kohanim couldn't say like, no, we want the first aliyah.
That's so strange. So strange.
Okay, wait, David, what do you find strange about it?
I think it's ridiculous. I mean, I've been in shuls where I'm not going to say, I can't remember if it was Kohanim, but someone would buy an aliyah, let's say Shlishi, and give it to someone
Yeah.
to honor that person. So I could see where, if God willing, I had a lot of money and I wanted to buy Cohen, I can't go up there, but I give it to a Cohen. I give
Yeah.
to Yaakov Cohen. But I can't see how you can go up there if you're not the Cohen.
Oh, so you are right that in general you don't go up there if you're not the Kohen, except there was this one exception for the first Aliyah of Parshat Breshit because it was like such an exceedingly, uh wonderful, fundraising opportunity that the shuls for that one Aliyah they would do it. But you're right. In
Rabbi,
general, even when there are auctions, the first Aliyah only goes to a Kohen.
Wendy,
Yeah.
is that same thing is true for when they have on Sukkot on Simchas Torah when they have Chassan Brachos has to be for a Kohen?
No, because if you remember on Simchat Torah, the Chatan Breshit is the fifth Aliyah, right? Or the sixth Aliyah. It's the later Aliyah, right?
Mhm.
Because we read it first. We read the all of Zot HaBracha, right? And then we read Breshit. So it's not the first Aliyah anymore. But
Uh,
the next the first Shabbat after Simchat Torah when Breshit is the Parsha, that's where the first Aliyah Breshit is the Kohen Aliyah.
okay.
Okay, so let's look back at our sources. So example number one of how we prevent fights from breaking out is we give the first Aliyah to the Kohen, and that way not everybody else fights about it. Okay, here's our second example. The Shulchan Aruch says, "Makom shemafsikin b'Shabbat b'Shacharit, sham korin b'mincha." So basically, if you think about, let's say, this past week, right? This past week, our parsha was Parshat Ekev. Once we got to the beginning of Parshat Ekev, right, we finished on Shabbat morning with the end of Parshat Ekev. So for Mincha on Shabbat, we pick up right there at the beginning of Parshat Re'eh, right? That's the way that it works, right? Wherever you finished reading on Shabbat morning, you sort of start from there on Shabbat afternoon and you read the first Aliyah of that next parsha. Uvashini uvachamishi, right? And the same thing is true with the Torah reading this morning on Monday and then again on Thursday, right? Wherever we finished off on Shabbat morning, we pick up, we read that first Aliyah at Mincha and on Monday and on Thursday, right? So we read the first Aliyah of Parsha Re'eh on Shabbat afternoon at Mincha and again this morning and again on Thursday morning. Uvi Shabbat Haba, and then this coming Shabbat, we'll read all of Parsha Re'eh, starting with again that same Aliyah, the first Aliyah of Parsha Re'eh. Fine, that's the way it works in a normal. Then the Rama is, so the Shulchan Aruch was authored by Rav Yosef Karo, and Rav Yosef Karo reflects the Sephardi position of things, and the Rama is Rav Moshe Isserlis, and he writes kind of a gloss on the Shulchan Aruch that sometimes explains things and sometimes reflects the Ashkenaz position. So here, the Haggah is the added note of the Rama. The Rama now says, Im bitlu Shabbat achat kriyat haparasha betzibor. If on one particular Shabbat they missed out on reading a public reading of the parasha, the Shabbat haba'a korino ta parasha im parsha shayacha lo ta Shabbat. Right. So if for some reason this past week we had not read Parshat Ekev, then next week we would read Parshat Ekev along with Parshat Re'eh. Right. If somehow something happened to cause us to miss out on reading the parsha this past week, then next week we would make up for it, right? We would read not just this coming week's parsha, Parsha A, but we would also read last week's parsha, Parsha Eget. Now, we were to pause for one moment and think about, right, what are the kinds of things that could cause a community to not have a Torah reading on any given Shabbat?
A disaster, an emergency, like what do you call that? An active shooter, God forbid.
Okay, right. So it could be something really terrible, like an active shooter, exactly. Or it could be something kind of much more regular, but also disruptive, like a blizzard, right? Let's say there's a blizzard and no one can get to shul. Or maybe the Baal Koreh loses his voice, right? And isn't able to read and nobody else knows how to, right? We could probably generate lots and lots of reasons why it could be that a community could like somehow not read. Maybe it's a small community and one of the members is unwell and they don't have a minyan, so they can't read the Torah, right? You can think of like lots of very regular reasons why a community might not read the Torah on any given Shabbat, and also some very terrible reasons like the one that Tova suggested. But But there are lots of reasons why the community could not read it, and therefore the halacha is if you miss reading the parsha on one week, the next week you would make up for it by reading the two parshiot together. Okay, so we can think of lots of sort of regular reasons, but in the mind of the halacha, there's only one reason here why the community has missed out on reading the parsha, and here is the reason. The Mishnah Berurah says, why have they missed out? Machmat ktata uchedomeh, because of arguing and other such things. Umayri shelo karu kol hayom. And what we're discussing here is a situation where they didn't read the Torah all day that Shabbat, right? Basically, the community got into a tremendous fight and argument on Shabbat morning, so much so that the Torah was not read, and they kept fighting all day long, right? Big fight broke out, and they couldn't read the Torah that morning, but also they couldn't read it that afternoon because they were still fighting.
Where was the rabbi to solve the problem?
Part of the fight, presumably, right? Part of the fight.
Wait a second. If this is a mashal, Rabba, Wendy, if this is a mashal, then it probably happened.
100%. I mean, I think when we read it will sound like something that for sure has happened, right? Because they're going to get very specific about it, right? They'll say, "Aval im bitlu rak b'shacharit takriya uva mincha kvar matzu menucha." Right? Let's say though, maybe the community got into a really big fight on Shabbat morning, but by mincha time they made up with one another, right? Somebody got offended, they all got into a big fight, there was a big fracas, but then by Shabbat afternoon, everybody's calmed down. I like the language here. Kvar matzu mincha, they had found peace. Im yesh pnai likrot kol hasidra, yikru b'mincha kol hasidra, v'yikru shiva gavrei, ki kol yom haShabbat hu zman hakriya. Right? So if by mincha time they had found peace, if there's enough time before Shabbat ends to read the whole parsha, they should read the whole parsha at mincha with 7 aliyot and so forth, because all of Shabbat day is suitable for Torah reading, right? We generally like to read the Torah on Shabbat morning, the whole parsha. But if there was a big fight and the people couldn't read the parsha in the morning, if they all make up with one another by the afternoon, they can read the whole parsha in the afternoon with 7 aliyot. Aval in gam b'mincha lo haya menucha. But even by mincha time, they had not yet found peace. Lo yikru b'sheni o b'chamishi kol hasidra. Right? Let's say the community, big fight on Shabbat morning, they're still fighting on Shabbat afternoon, but then by Sunday night, everybody makes up, and now it's Monday morning. And we know that there's Torah reading on Monday morning. So we might have thought, okay, great. Now that everybody has made up on Monday morning, maybe we should read the entire parsha from last week on Monday morning, right? With 7 aliyot. But the Mishnah Berurah says no. If they don't make up until a weekday, you shouldn't read the whole parsha on Monday or Thursday. Ki b'chol yesh bitul melacha. Because on weekdays, people have to get to work, right? People cannot, right? If people are expecting to have their 7:30 minyan be done by 8:15, we can't suddenly read the whole parsha and keep people there until 9 because people have to get to work, right? That's not okay. Ela yikru rak parasha min seder shel Shabbat haba v'lo min Shabbat ha'ava, right? So because they're going to keep people from work, then what we do is we read the first aliyah from the next parsha, and then on the following Shabbat, you would read the parsha from the week before and the parsha from the week afterwards. Okay, so let's just think about this for one moment, right? Let's picture the scene, right? Everybody's in shul, they're all ready for the Torah reading. A crazy fight breaks out. Everybody's arguing at one another. The Torah reading doesn't happen, right? So then we're told, okay, if let's say, calmer heads prevail and peace is once again restored by Shabbat afternoon, then we would read the entire parsha on Shabbat afternoon. But if not, then we have to wait until the next week. And the next week we would read all of the previous parsha, right? All of Parshat Ekev, and the coming week, all of Parsha Re'eh. Now, so we understand that, right? And that makes sense if we have a situation where it's one parsha this week, one parsha next week. But let's say the big fight broke out on Parshat Truma Tetzaveh, right? Let's say it's a week where Truma and Tetzaveh are read together, right? Or Vayakel Pekudei. Yeah, let's do that. let's imagine that the big fight breaks out on Parshat Kitisa, right? Big fight on Parshat Kitisa. The Torah reading doesn't get read in the morning nor in the afternoon, but the following week is Parshat Vayakhel Pekude, which is already a double parsha. So what do you think? Do we read Kitisa and Vayakhel and Pekude all on one Shabbat, or do we not? What would you think?
Maybe they spread them out over the Monday and Thursday, just as a suggestion.
Yeah, Judy, that is a great suggestion. But remember, we're worried about reading too much on Monday or Thursday because we don't want people to be late
Right.
for work. Right. So let's see here. We'll see, right? So
I say that you don't read it.
you say that you don't read it, Tova. Okay. Yeah. So the Magen Avraham agrees with Tova. Let's check it out over here. Here we go. The Magen Avraham of Avraham Gombener says,
chance.
yes, exactly. He says, right, Bitlu Shabbat, V'hu hadin im hitchilu v'lo simu machmat tata. The first thing he says is that this is true whether the fight broke out before the Torah reading and the Torah wasn't read at all, or if, let's say, the Torah reading began and in the middle of the Torah reading the fight broke out and so they just weren't able to finish the parsha. Either way, then the next week you would read the whole parsha. Aval im hayu shnayim mechubarim ba'ota Shabbat shebitlu. But if there were two parshiot it was a double parsha when on the week that we missed the Torah reading, ein korin b'Shabbat haba'a shlosha. We don't read three parshiot the next week, Delo matzinu le'olam shekorim gimel, because we never find three parshiot read, right? What the Magen Avraham is saying is that because on some weeks anyway we double up the parsha, right? This coming year we're going to have very few double parshas because it's a leap year, right? We have an extra month of Adar this coming year, but in general, when it's not a leap year, there are lots of weeks, right? Vayakhel Pekudi go together, Truma Tetzaveh go together, Bahar Bechukotai go together, right? There often Chukat Balak goes together. So because we have a tradition of sometimes reading two parshiot together, if the community misses reading one parsha one week, then it's not a big deal to have a double parsha the next week. But the Magen Avraham says we never have three parshiot together. And because we never have three parshiot read together, if, let's say, the week that was missed was a double parsha, then you wouldn't make up the double parsha on the next week because we only ever read two parshiot together and not three. Now, this Magen Avraham actually became a part of the communal conversation during COVID, because if you remember, many shuls didn't meet for many weeks, right? So you might have wondered, right? Do you think that the thing to do, if you haven't met, most shuls stopped meeting, at least in New York, sometime in March of 2020, right? And didn't meet up again until the end of the summer. So should we make up all of those parshiot, right? Should we, when the first time the shul met again, should they read like 20 parshiot? And the sense is, we never read more than two parshiot on a Shabbat. So you could make up, I guess, the week beforehand, but not more than that.
Excuse me, we don't read two parshiot more than two parshiot because the judge said, oh, we don't do three. I don't think there's any reason given for that. If you missed a parsha, I'm not talking about COVID, 1,000 parshiot to read. But if you miss one, you have a double one. I still don't see why you simply can't do three, other than say, well, we don't do three.
Well, I will tell that. You see, this is what I would think, David, is because even for reading two, there are, you see here grumbling, oh gosh, davening is taking so long. And there's many people say, so who mumble even about two, let alone if there would be three, so there would be even more people, say, oh gosh, can we ever finish with davening already? It's taking so long, particularly if there's a good kiddush available.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. My sense is that because there's generally a practice of reading two parshiot, then there's a sense that if you miss one, it's reasonable to then read two. But I think you're right, Bert. I think people have maybe it's that people have an expectation that sometimes in shul there'll be two parshiot, but people never expect for there to be three parshiot. So that might be part of it. Maybe a sense of expectation or just a sense of what's in a reasonable amount of time for people to kind of sit in shul here. It's a good point. Okay, so we have one more source over here. Let's see. Any other questions before we move on to our?
Can I just ask for mincha? Where now they're reading the parsha that they didn't do in the morning. What about the three mincha liyot?
So what they're saying is, if we're reading the whole parsha, we would read it with 7 aliyot.
And we skipped? we skip the additional portion? We had
Yeah,
the three of
yeah,
the
exactly,
okay.
exactly. Yeah, because if you remember what they said is wherever we stopped reading in the morning, that's where we pick up at Mincha. But if we didn't read the parsha in the morning, then at
Oh,
Mincha would be the right time.
So
Um,
it's just to be clear, it's that parsha only that you missed. Okay, the seven aliyot. You don't also tack on an additional three aliyot,
right,
for the
right,
next one. You don't take out a
right,
second sefer Torah.
right. I think on Monday you would move on to the next one, but on that Shabbat at Mincha you would read the seven that you had
mm.
missed. Exactly. Okay, great.
It's interesting the structure of the word mincha and menucha. So mincha brings menucha.
Yeah. I think that's probably a little bit of a play on words there, right? If at Mincha they had not found Menucha. Yeah, it's a great point, Judy. Thank you. Okay, here we go. All right, the last source is kind of my favorite over here. So the Mishnah Berurah here quotes a book called the Sha'arei Ephraim. The Sha'arei Ephraim was authored by Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Margaliot. He lives in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and he basically writes a book about the halachot of Torah reading and related matters, right? Torah reading and other related synagogue matters. And a lot of what he talks about in the book, as you can imagine, is how do we prevent fights from breaking out, right? And so one of the things that he talks about is the importance of choosing the right gabbai. Is anybody in our class a gabbai?
No.
Okay, right? There's a big focus on choosing the right sort of person to be a gabbai. So here's his description of what are we looking for when we're looking for the right gabbai. So the Mishnah Berurah, quoting the Sha'arei Ephraim, says, "Katuv b'sefer Sha'arei Ephraim, mizeh yesh lilmod sheyesh livchor lasgan, ish nichbad uba'al ma'asim tovim." It says we learned from this, and basically, sorry, what he's referring to is there's a description of how since the Torah was initially given to the people of Israel through an intermediary, through Moshe, we always want there to be like more than one person standing at the Torah reading. We want there to be at least one gabbai, preferably two gabbais, because there's always like sort of more than one person around when the Torah is being given. So he says from this idea that we like, because the Torah was given through Moshe and the Gabbai is kind of supposed to sort of embody the experience of Moshe and the Torah, we should learn from this that when we choose the Gabbai, who he's calling the Sigan, right, another word for Gabbai, we should choose a person who is nichbad, who's very honorable and distinguished, uba'al ma'asim tovim, and a person who does good deeds, and very importantly, dat habriot nocha hemenu. The person has to be well liked. People have to, sort of be at peace with this person. Why? Shelo yachshaduhu shebishvil hana'at atzmo, or eze siba, yitmoch kavod lemi she'eino ra'oi. Right? We don't want anybody to be sort of casting aspersions on the motivation of the gabbai. So we want the gabbai to be a person who's very respected, known for doing good deeds, and people really like him. So that way they won't suspect that the gabbai is giving out honors just for his own benefit, right? Either giving an honor to a person who doesn't deserve it, or bihipuch, or the opposite, denying an honor to a person who does deserve it, right? So the idea is if everybody really likes the gabbai and respects the gabbai, if they see the gabbai giving shlishi to so-and-so, they don't say, oh, the gabbai just must want to get on the good side of so-and-so for some, other business reason or whatever. They will sort of assume the best about the gabbai because everybody likes the gabbai.
But
He says,
Wendy,
yeah, please.
a lot of times in synagogues,
Mhm.
it's the rich people that donate that get the honors. You know that in some synagogues, it's
Mhm.
that way. If you are a big donor, you end up it's becomes a business kind of thing. Am I wrong?
No, no, you're
Yeah,
right.
I mean, I think it depends on the synagogue, but you're right, and especially in synagogues where they auction off the Eliot, right? Even more so. But I think here the thought was that like we wouldn't there, you might even be able to argue like, well, maybe the Gabba is trying to like get people to donate more to the shul. I think here more the concern is that like, oh, the Gabba's best friend is like Joe, and so therefore he always gives Joe shlishi, right? Or the Gabbai, is hoping to like do a business deal with Max, and so that's why he's giving Max this aliyah or whatever, right? Like, sort of very personal reasons as opposed to something that's for the good of the kid. So we don't want anybody to suspect the gabbai of doing that, right? So that's why we want to choose a gabbai who people like and people respect. But then the Sharia Ephraim also says, "V'chein ra'ui latzibur shelo yiharharu acharei hasagan." But also from the perspective of the community, he's now speaking to the community. He says the community also should not second guess the gabbai. V'yadunu oto b'chol inyan l'chafzechu, right? They should always try to judge the gabbai favorably, right? They should say, oh, if the gabbai gave the third aliyah to Max, it must be because it was important for Max to get it, right? Maybe Max is praying for refuah shlema for somebody. Maybe, we should always sort of think well of the gabbai. We should judge the gabbai favorably. V'hadavar asher yikshe be'einehem, right? And if the gabbai makes a choice that is difficult for us, right? The gabbai gives the third aliyah to Max, and we all say, oh, Max, he's such a scoundrel. Why is the gabbai giving him that aliyah? It must be for some bad reason, right? So even if we think that in our hearts, the Sharia Ephraim says to us, Itlu ki mishgehaya. We should not accuse the gabbai of deliberately doing something bad. We should assume that it was a mistake. V'ta'a b'shikul hadat, right? The gabbai made an error of judgment. It's not that the gabbai wanted to offend Bert by giving the scoundrel Max the third aliyah. Just the gabbai, got confused. He thought he hadn't given Max an aliyah in a long time. He forgot that he gave him one last week or whatever it was, right? We should assume that it was an innocent mistake and not that the gabbai has nefarious, motivations. V'af imira shekara le'achad shelo lichvodo. And even if it happens that somebody gets an honor that feels like it is not befitting their honor, right? There are some shuls where shlishi is considered to be a really big honor and the fifth aliyah is not considered to be a big honor. So let's say on this particular week, the gabbai gave somebody the fifth aliyah. The person is very angry. They say, what? I don't deserve the fifth aliyah. I should get either the third aliyah or the sixth aliyah. The fifth one is not befitting my honor. And choshed lahasgan she'asa b'mitkaven lahachiso. This person who got the fifth aliyah says, oh, I know why the gabbai did this. He did it to make me angry and to insult me, right? So this person is now very angry that they've gotten the fifth aliyah. They think they should have gotten a better, different aliyah. And they're suspicious that the gabbai did it b'mitkaven lahachiso in order to, to insult him and make him angry. Im naga yirat Hashem b'levavo, if the person has any little smidgen of God-fearingness in their heart, yishlo lehitapek. That person, even though they're so offended, they should hold back. V'lo yomar lo davar, and that person shouldn't say anything to the gabbai, right? What the Sharia Ephraim is trying to do is to persuade the person who's very angry to not go over and start yelling at the gabbai in the middle of shul, right? Even if you really are convinced that the gabbai has offended you on purpose, still hold back. Do not say anything. Don't start a fight in shul. Right? Lo yomar lo davar. V'yisa kal v'chomer b'nafsho. And the person who's very offended should think about the following kal v'chomer. Right? A kal v'chomer is basically a way of saying, if this, then all the more so that. So this is the kal v'chomer that the Sharia Ephraim suggests that the person who's feeling very offended should think. The person should think to themselves, im karutz michomer. If a person who is pinched from clay, right? We human beings, what are we anyway, right? We were just pinched from clay by God when God molded the first human being out of the ground. So im karutz michomer tipa rucho, right? Even though we're nothing, we're just pinched from clay, still our spirits cling within us like a bell. Bingoa biktsei kvodo kechut hasara. If even a hair's breadth of our dignity is impinged upon, right? Basically, if we can get this angry, we human beings, who, what are we anyway? We're just pinched from clay. If we can get this angry over even tiny slights to our honor, how much more so should we be concerned about the honor of God, right? If very small slights can get us so angry and make us feel so insulted, we should think how much more important is it for us to safeguard the honor of God, whose honor is so much more important than the honor of regular human beings. And therefore, we should think about the honor of God and kavod Torah Toha Kedusha, and also the honor of God's holy Torah. Shelo la'ashot sharuriya al yedei zeh, right? Don't start a major fight about it, right? That's what the Shari Ephraim is saying, right? Even if you are very offended, even if you really think that you should have got Shlishi and not Max, and you got Chamishi and you're so offended, and you think the Gabbai did it on purpose to offend you, still the Shari Ephraim says, hold back. Do not start a fight. Think about how important God's honor is. Think about the honor of the Torah, right? And then he adds in one more line to really persuade the person not to say anything. He says, "V'hama'avir al midotav, ma'avirin lo al kol b'sha'av." If a person is willing to forgive their own honor, all of their sins are forgiven, right? So there's a lot of like emotional energy being put in over here to trying to prevent this guy from starting a fight in shul, right? Remember, we have our person's very offended that they were given an honor that they think is not the one they should have got, right? In my example, they were given Chamishi. They really think they should have been given the third Aliyah instead. They're so offended, right? They're so offended. They think that Gabbai did it on purpose to make them angry. And yet the Shari Ephraim says, we know that you're really offended, but please hold back and do not say anything in shul. Don't start a fight. And if you want extra incentives to not start a fight, think about the following things. Think about how insignificant human beings are compared to God. And if you're this upset about your honor, how much more so do we need to protect the honor of God and the honor of God's Torah? And also, if you're willing to forgive your honor in this manner, God will forgive all of your sins, right? There's a lot of like emotional energy being put into trying to persuade this person to not start a fight in shul. But as we keep going on, we'll see that despite this, the assumption was often all of these like efforts came to naught and the fights would still break out. And then we're told, and if somebody at the height of their anger starts a fight with the Gabbai, right? We have to picture the scene. The Gabbai is standing at the Torah. The Torah reader is reading the Torah. Somebody in the back of the shul who was given the fifth Aliyah instead of the third Aliyah is so angry and he's not able to hold back and stop himself from fighting. He starts yelling out from the back of the shul, "What's wrong with you, Gabbai? Why did you give Max the third Aliyah? It should have been for me," right? The person is really, really yelling at the Gabbai, right? So imechad begova po asami rivai maskan. So now the Shari Ephraim turns to the Gabbai and says, look, I understand that this guy is yelling at you from the back of the room, but you are the Gabbai, and it is your job to be a person who absorbs the insult and remains in your place, right? What does the Shari Ephraim not want the Gabbai to do?
Yell back.
Do not yell back. And even more than that, don't leave your place to go and yell back, right? We're picturing, right, the guy in the back is yelling, the Gabbai is standing there hearing all these insults coming their way. And the Shari Ephraim says, Gabbai, it is your job to absorb the insult. Lo yaniach mikomo. Stay in your place. Stay by the Torah. Keep the synagogue ritual going. Don't leave where you are and start fighting. But let's say the Gabbai isn't able to do this, right? He's not able to stay there because the other guy in the back is hurling insults at him, offending him. So the Gabbai leaves the Torah, goes to the back to kind of continue the fight. So imasgan hiniach sefer Torah v'halachlo because the guy in the back was inciting him with words, right? Was yelling all these insults at him. The Shari Ephraim says we should then punish the Gabbai. Ki madam chata, because even if a person sinned by insulting him and yelling all these insults at him, Sefer Torah lama biyesh, right? Why should the Torah be disgraced? The Torah hasn't done anything wrong. It was the Gabbai's job to stand by the Torah. And instead, the Gabbai has left the Torah to go to the back of the room to yell at the other person, and that's really not okay. So,
what kind of punishment does he get?
We don't know. Probably some sort of fine, I guess would be, or maybe remove his job as Gabbai. He doesn't specify, but something like that. Now, what I think is really interesting.
Because that really just perpetuates the negativity.
Yeah,
Yes.
100%, Judy. I definitely agree with you. So what I think is really interesting about, so remember, the Mishnah Berurah has been quoting this passage from the Shirei Ephraim, is that it doesn't sound like it's theoretical, right? It sounds like he's describing events that people have seen, right? You know, we know that you're so angry, but try really hard to like hold back and not say anything. And you, Gabbai, we know that you're getting all these insults, but absorb the insults. Don't leave the Torah to go yell back at the other guy. And if the Gabbai, if the person isn't able to hold back and does yell out the insults, and the Gabbai isn't able to absorb the insults and like leaves the Torah to go and yell at the other person, right? That's also really not okay. The community needs to step in and say this isn't okay.
But Torah is amazing because a lot of the theories on leadership and on management and on psychology come from the Torah. It's talking about emotional intelligence and being able to manage your emotions without reacting in a way that can sever relationships. So he has to be aware that he's angry, but he shouldn't act on it.
Yeah,
That's what he's basically
100%.
saying.
100%, exactly, right?
It's very
We
difficult.
angry, but yeah,
It's
100%.
very
But
difficult.
why wasn't this from the get-go like there should be a motto, ensure we don't have fights, period?
So I think that's what they're trying to do, right? What they're trying to do is have this motto be ensure we don't have fights. But yet when you read it, you get the sense that like there were fights, right? You
It
get the
doesn't
sense
work
like
that way. It's
he's
not
not,
reality.
yeah, he's right. The Sharia Ephraim is not making this up, right? It sounds like he's like describing events that
I
that
saw.
everybody knew about and that they had seen. So I think two things are interesting about this to me, right? One is, well, okay, I'll say two things. One is that I think one question that emerges from this is like, why were people getting into fights in shul, right? What do you think that was about, right? And do you think that this still happens? So
Oh,
what I say,
absolutely. Absolutely.
okay,
I belong to a shul in Croton on Hudson, the
mhm,
Croton Jewish Center. It was a small shul. It was like a family. There were 50 families. It imploded.
yeah,
It imploded because
yeah,
one family wanted to run, didn't want a rabbi, and so every rabbi that came was a problem for them. It was
right,
terrible. It was
yeah.
terrible.
Yeah. So I will tell you, Tova, based exactly aligned with what you're saying. I've taught these sources a couple of times in a couple of different shuls, and always afterwards, people come up to me and they're like, "Yeah, I was a gabbai for 20 years in the shul, and this always happened." Right. So people often have stories about this. Other people will say, "Really, like that doesn't seem right." But then the other, so I think probably depends a bit on the synagogue.
Can I suggest
But
something? I'm
please,
sorry, to continue. That it used to be, when we lived in smaller communities, you had one shul that you would go to, because they didn't have two or three or 17 shuls
You
like they
have
have in River,
choices.
and that therefore, there's a greater likelihood, I think, then, that you're going to be in a shul where you're not comfortable with some people and you have, and you might get into fights with them. Whereas, if you go to a shul that you're not happy with, here in the United States, typically you have a choice of like 10 other shuls to go to, and find one where you would, not be, feel out of place and not feel insulted. So I think that's it. And I just wanted to remember that popped in my head too. You talk about fighting, is that also in selecting a Baal Tefillah, isn't there also things that say that you have to be sure to select one who is popular in the community, and that that wouldn't cause a fight about, oh, you gave, you have the chazan is so and so, I hate him, so that they have to be popular in the community as well.
yes, although I think that with the Chazan, we're even more worried about the Chazan hating people, right? Because there are these interesting halachot where if the Chazan thinks to himself, like, oh, I'm only having the kavanah for my tefillot to apply to my friends and not to my enemies, and the halacha is if the Chazan doesn't intend for his tefillah to like be on behalf of everybody, then it's on behalf of nobody, right? Like, so I think there was a sense also that we wanted the Chazan also, like, not just that everybody else has to like the Chazan, but the Chazan also has to like everybody, right? Otherwise, or at least, be willing to represent everybody. Otherwise, there was a sense that, he was the wrong choice also. So I think though, in terms of, so Bert, I think you're making a great point, right? So maybe one reason why these fights would break out or it seems like there was always the threat of fights breaking out was that often maybe there was only one shul in the community that people went to, so they were really kind of together all the time. I think another possibility is that um I think people really cared about what happened in shul, right? It was like, a place where like all of the sort of important goings on of the community were worked out, right? Shuls were very central to the social life of the community. And so it would make sense then if it's a place where you really care about what happens, then even small things, right? Because like you sort of define yourself based on your standing in this synagogue community, even very small things can feel very important. And I think there might be shuls where things are much more calm, but that could sometimes be a sign of people being like less invested in the going outside in shul. And I think the real challenge for us is to like have shul be a place that is, very central to our religious experience and our Torah experience, but also have it be calm, right? And I think that's where it gets tricky, right? If you don't really care so much about what's happening there, it's pretty easy to like not get into a fight. But if you really care about it and it's really important to you, but also it's a place where people aren't fighting, that seems like the really hard thing to get. That's the hard place to get to. And that's what I think a lot of these sources are trying to do. One other quick example that I didn't include in the source sheets because I thought we might not have time, but I think is interesting, is there's a different halacha where, let's say, we give the third aliyah to uh, let's just choose David. We give the third aliyah to David. David comes up and he says, "Hey, I actually know how to lane this aliyah, right? I've laned it before, right?" And let's say Bert is the gabbai, and Bert says, "Yeah, David says he knows the aliyah. He really does, right? And maybe David should be allowed to lane the aliyah." The halacha is that no, Bert cannot let David lane that aliyah, because if Bert lets David lane that aliyah, then whoever gets the fourth aliyah is going to come up and is going to say, "Well, I want to lane my aliyah. You let David lane his aliyah. I want to
Right.
lane mine." But Bert might know that the person who has the fourth aliyah isn't really a very good laner and isn't going to do a good job. But if Bert says no to this guy, then this guy is going to start a big fight. And so therefore, even though Bert knows that David would do a great job laning, Bert has to say no to David to prevent the next person from wanting to lane and then getting into a fight. And what I like about that halakha is that it feels like it's so many steps ahead, right? To be like, oh,
Very
David
sensitive.
knows how to lane it,
Yes.
and we know that it's right, but Bert has to think like 4 steps ahead and say no to David, so that way the next person who might then also be inspired to say that he wants to lane but might not be good at it, right? So it feels like there's like a lot of thought that's put into trying to keep the peace. And that also feels inspiring to me, right? It feels like shalom is so important that we have to like always be thinking many steps ahead to try to preserve the peace. It's not just enough in the moment to tell people, look, we know you're upset, don't start a fight. But we also like, we want to sort of use the halachot as like as almost um, like a 12-point plan for peace, right? We want to be sort of thinking ahead about like what are potential areas that could cause friction and could cause people to fight and try to like get ahead of it right now to do it. And even though David would do a great job laning, we're going to have to say no to him because we really don't want someone else to be offended and we really don't want other fights to break out.
Okay.
And so
Thank you.
I see that we are out of time,
Thank
but
you.
I'm just
Thank you
gonna,
very much.
oh yeah,
Let me
please.
just interject something. I went to yeshiva in my life 17 years, 9 years for elementary school, 4 years for high school, and four for college. And during the entire 17 years, we never studied any of these halachot. And none of the halacha pertaining to Beit HaMedrash. We always would do the same batch. We'd do, how many shofrot do you do? How many, so I must have done shofrot about 14 times out of 17 years, and I must have done that. Never in the other stuff. Some people, I probably wasn't even aware that there was such halachot.
Mhm.
Can I say
Yeah.
one comment?
Please.
Yes, when I read the title of our Torah today, I thought you, because of what's going on in a shul that I go to, you were going to be talking about talking in shul. So if people, if that was the case and that was nipped in the bud, you wouldn't even get to trying to be
right.
preemptive. You wouldn't get to all these internal fights if talking was nipped in the bud and people were more respectful of the Torah and Hashem and the place of Hashem, then we wouldn't be fighting in shul.
I think it's a
That,
great point, Judy, that like there's a sense that if we could kind of constantly keep in mind like the sanctity of what
Makom
we do,
Kadosh.
then now, yeah, I think that
On
is true.
some, Rabba, Wendy, on some of the shuls, there's a shul that I go to. I think it's in New Jersey in Highland Park. On the door of the Aron Kodesh,
Mhm.
Da lifnei mi
Ata Omed.
ata omed.
Right.
Know
Right.
before who you are standing.
Right.
If people understood that, maybe they would act differently.
Yeah.
Good
Yeah.
point.
Oh,
Yes.
I found that, I don't know if you've seen this, that there's a special bracha that that is said in some shuls many years ago for people who do not talk in shul, you know.
Really?
Yes. In other words, a special thing that says, oh, Baruch Hashem, you created some people who do not talk in shul.
That's
That's
amazing.
great.
That's amazing.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Rabba.
you.
Thank you
You
so
are
much. It was really great to
amazing.
learn with everybody.
You
Thank
are
you.
What a fun thing.
amazing.
Thank you for
I
remembering.
love your contact information because maybe I could get you to speak at
Yeah,
my Tehillim
for
group.
sure, for sure, for sure. Here, I'll
I'll
put
get it
my
from
email.
Bert. I'll
Yeah,
get it
I
from
can
Bert.
also I'll put my
okay,
Where are
email
you
address
located?
in the
Where are you
chat.
located?
So I live on the Upper West Side, but I teach at Yeshivat Maharat. So
Oh, that would be
I'm in Riverdale
wonderful.
pretty early.
You are
Here, I'll put my
amazing.
thank
thank you
you,
so
all right,
much.
thank you.
Bert, could you
Bye.
send me the contact information?
Yeah, I just put my email address in the chat
Okay.
if that's useful.
Okay.
Thank you so
Also,
much.
my mom always knows how to find me.
That's good.
Have a good Shabbos,
Thank you
everyone.
Okay.
so much.
Good
It was
job.
You
really,
Thank
too.
you,
really
Bert.
Next
wonderful
week
learning with
Okay,
you.
we're going to
Very
have the
interesting.
first of two parts with Rabbi Linzer.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Okay,
thanks, Bert.
Thanks again.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Thank you.